I've been a big South Park fan my whole life. Been watching since day one, since I was like 8 years old, when I probably shouldn't have been watching it. For a long time, the world of South Park video games was super rocky. Despite South Park being around for upwards of 30 years now, it wasn't until the past decade that it actually got some true recognition in the video game world. Today, I want to take a look back at all of it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. From the first South Park game back in the 90s all the way up to present day. So, grab a heapin' helpin' of member berries and come along for the ride.
Alright, a lot of you probably know the drill by now, but for those who are new here, it's pretty simple. I'm gonna be taking a look at every South Park game in chronological order. Normally, I'd stick to mainline releases on console, but since there are some weird entries here and there that I think are worth talking about, we're gonna go a little bit deeper this time around. Alright? The infamous first ever South Park game, and one I admittedly loved when I was a kid. In all honesty, it's still a guilty pleasure for me despite how much everyone seems to hate it. When South Park first came out in the 90s, it blew up seemingly overnight. It was hard to go anywhere without seeing toys, shirts, and any other kinds of merch. Even bootleg merch was rampant back then. It became a cash cow in a very short period of time, so deciding to make a video game was kind of a no-brainer considering its popularity. The game was developed in a mere 6 months and released for both the N64 and PS1 back in 1998. Growing up, I had the N64 version, so that's the one I'm familiar with. Now, 6 months is definitely an alarming amount of time that should clue you in on all you need to know about how much effort and care went into crafting this experience, but some slack can be cut since Acclaim, the company who snagged up the license for South Park video games at the time, actually used the Turok 2 engine to build on. So even though 6 months is definitely not a lot of time to develop a game, a big chunk of the groundwork was at least set going into it. Now, if you're completely unaware of South Park's history as far as video games go, you're probably surprised to find out that the first time anyone took a crack at making a game based on the South Park IP, they decided to go with an FPS. I still, to this day, have absolutely no idea how out of all the game genres they could have picked, they landed on FPS. That being said, this, in my opinion, is one of the few reasons why I still find this game charming to this day. See, this is not only the first time we're able to explore the world of South Park firsthand, but experience it in full 3D. Even having a completely remade 3D version of the show's intro. Considering that the show itself is 2D, this adds an entirely new layer of depth to the game. No pun intended. The premise of the game is pretty simple. Every 666 years, a comet comes around, and with the threat of an apocalypse, the boys set out to save the world. And I think the comet's making, like, everybody crazy or something, too. That's a detail. So from the start, you get to pick whether to start the game as Stan, Kyle, Kenny, or Cartman. And in Stage 1, your first objective is to explore the town and find your friends. Once you do this, you're off to the races. Most stages are really linear and consist of navigating to the end while needing to take out often literal hordes of enemies. Quite frankly, too many enemies if I'm being real here. The game does start to chug a lot just because of the sheer volume of enemies it tends to throw at you. These enemies you'll find mainly consist of various familiar elements from the early days of the show like turkeys, cows, and aliens. I'll admit the enemy variety is definitely a bit bland, not in terms of enemy type though, but rather how the AI works. They all, regardless of type, operate roughly the same. They just kind of rush at you. So while the enemies do change for each stage aesthetically, they act pretty much identically. Now the weapons, however, are not like that at all and do actually have a ton of variety. One of my favorite things about this game is the creativity found in your arsenal. Instead of your typical fists as a base and id Software gun tier system you'd see out of many other shooters at the time, South Park has a bunch of unconventional weapons like a toilet plunger gun, a piranha launcher, an automatic Nerf gun, a dodgeball, which causes a ton of recoil to whichever enemy it hits and feels super satisfying. And even the base attack, which mirrors punching, is the snowball, itself even has an alt attack. The piss snowball. Takes longer to load up, but does more damage. There's even little Terrence and Phillip fart grenades. The game also does have its fair share of bosses as well. A giant enemy with a big HP pool. Sometimes straightforward and easy, and other times not so much. Like I said, I happen to like this game a lot, but I won't be blind to the fact that it's definitely in large part due to nostalgia. This game is super flawed. It's repetitive, not just in its gameplay, but in its dialogue and music. Like I said, because of the crazy number of enemies thrown at you, quite often, there's a lot of slowdown. The draw distance is insane, even for an N64 game. It has some of the most extreme fog I've ever seen, which actually sometimes makes it difficult to navigate stages and makes it pretty easy to get a little lost. And despite being able to explore South Park, South Park itself feels very barren and empty, since there really aren't any NPCs or anything inhabiting the different locations you visit. Even the creators of South Park, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, have said for years that this game was terrible, but I wouldn't really go that far. I get being ashamed of how the game turned out if it wasn't up to their standards, but personally, I really don't think the game is that bad. If nothing else, you can do a lot worse, and for a single-player campaign FPS on the N64, I think it's definitely a game you can get something out of if you're a fan of the show. Back in the 90s, for a while, this was all we had in terms of a South Park video game, and I was never disappointed by it, at least when I was a kid. It was also one of the few games to come out for the N64 that I'm surprised was not censored by Nintendo. Now, I know I started this video off by talking about the South Park FPS, and that's because it was the first South Park game ever released. However, to say that it was the first South Park game ever would be a bit inaccurate. Let me explain by taking you back in time, back to November of 1998. 9-year-old me was looking through the new issue of Nintendo Power, issue 114, the one with big ol' Ocarina of Time Link on the cover. For some reason, I was super obsessed with this issue. I don't know why. In part due to how eager I was to play Ocarina of Time, maybe, and how much I loved Link's new design, to the point where I traced the issue's cover in an art book. And also, probably in larger part due to 2 unassuming pages that lie among the 148 pages of the magazine. As I said from the start, I've always been a huge South Park fan, even during the years I shouldn't have been. And though I got the N64 South Park game pretty soon after it came out, there has been one game that had been on my mind, plaguing my brain for literal decades. A game I was super excited to play, waited for, but never heard about again. Page 127 of that issue of Nintendo Power featured a big full-page ad for the new South Park game, the one for the N64, the one everyone is familiar with. But wait, in the lower left corner, you can see the Game Boy logo. That's weird. Well, skip forward all the way towards the end of the magazine, and on page 142, you'll find a screenshot of a South Park game, published by Acclaim for what is clearly the Game Boy Color. Divert your eyes to the right, and you'll find 2 columns of upcoming releases, called the Release Forecast. One for upcoming N64 games, and the other for upcoming Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. And right there, among the couple dozen other games, South Park for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, slated for release in fall of 1998. Well, damn, 1998 sure's lasted a long fucking time because the game still isn't out. Know why? It never fucking came out! And for decades, I felt gaslit by the universe thinking I fucking imagined that this thing even existed. I'm serious, this caused me legitimate mental distress. Years later, I didn't have a copy of that issue of Nintendo Power, and all I had to go on was memory. For a while, I was really wondering if my 9-year-old brain just imagined it. It wasn't until I was much older that I found out, nah, it was real, it just got canceled. Turns out, Matt and Trey were the ones responsible for its cancellation. Being that the Game Boy was primarily marketed towards children, they felt it wouldn't be a good fit from both a marketing and moral standpoint, and thus, the game was canned. A lot of you might be familiar with this now, but as the story goes, the groundwork of the game was then repurposed for 2 different other IPs. In Europe, it was reworked into a game called Maya the Bee, and in America, it was turned into a couple Mary-Kate and Ashley games. But what of that original South Park version of the game? Was it in its early stages of development? Was it close to being done? Just how far along was it exactly? Well, fast forward to 2018, and the game was, much to my surprise, leaked online. Not only was it in a totally playable state, but it's literally, fully complete, with the exception of a level skip button, which was probably only meant for debugging and not intended to be in a commercial release. Finally, after literally almost 25 years, I am playing a game that for decades I was convinced I either made up in my own head or was misremembering. South Park for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. So how is it? What is it? Well, it's a puzzle platformer, and honestly, a surprisingly decent one considering South Park's track record with video games at the time. The goal for most stages is to save Kenny. Kenny's trapped in a cage in any number of stages, and it's up to the 3 other boys to rescue him. Each has their own strengths and weaknesses. Stan can throw Cartman to attack enemies, which is the only means of offense in the game, and he's also the only one who can flip the switch needed to open Kenny's cell. And it only opens temporarily, so you need to get either Kyle or Cartman over to wherever Kenny is before flipping the switch. Kyle's hat can be bounced off of, and he can jump higher than the other 2. Cartman not only can be used as a literal weapon, but his head can be stood on, allowing him to carry another character. But he also, ironically, is the only character that can swim, and coupled with the other ability, is capable of transporting Kyle or Stan over bodies of water. Now, most of the stages are set up this way. Flip the switch, rescue Kenny. But the game also has boss fights against a bunch of secondary characters from the show, all who have gotten crazy and started attacking. Different methods are required to defeat them depending on the boss fight, with some being as simple as reaching the boss, and others by doing things like using the boss's attacks against them. While these bosses aren't too overly interesting, it is a refreshing change of pace since the main stages of the game do start to get a little formulaic and repetitive, and there are admittedly a lot of stages in the game. It actually has way more content than I would have expected it to, and even features quite a bit of cutscene content in between stages. The game even has a decent amount of voice samples of the various characters from the show. Sure, they're bit crushed to all hell, but they are there. Now, none of you know this. Well, some of you might, if you happen to have run into us at a convention, but my group of friends, who are all other creators you probably watch, over the years have become obsessed with an OST of a game I played a ton when I was a kid. Pictionary for the NES. Sounds like an odd one, I know, but it goes way harder than it has any right to, and nearly every time we see each other, at some point, we fire up the Pictionary OST and jam the fuck out. This has a point, I promise. I say this because the composer for that game and quite a few other games of that era's name is Tim Follin. At only, I believe, 19 years old, he crafted the legendary OST that is Pictionary. We've all become super big Tim Follin fans over the years, so you can imagine the double take that I did when I saw Tim's name pop up in the South Park game for Game Boy's credits as the composer. I immediately texted Ant Dude about it. Now, I will say, not the man's best work, that's for sure, but it's still pretty insane to see and took me by surprise. I know I went off on a little tangent, but after seeing his name pop up, I couldn't possibly not talk about this detail. All in all, though, the game is solid. It's really a shame it never came out, but at least now, decades later, it finally saw the light of day and can be enjoyed by everyone. And it finally put a long-running mystery to bed for me. Well, Acclaim wasted no time keeping the ball rolling. They had that precious South Park IP in their clutches and were making sure to make full use of it. Less than a year later, South Park Chef's Love Shack was released for the N64, and a few months later for the PS1, Windows, and even the Dreamcast this time around. Now, if you thought the South Park FPS was a rush job that lacked quality, boy, do I have some unfortunate news for you. Not only do we have a rush job that lacks quality, but we also have a rush job that lacks any kind of substance, content, or length. I vaguely remember this game existing back in the day, but out of the old South Park games that came out, I only ever played the original one. I didn't have any friends who had any of the other games either, and if I'm being totally upfront, I was never really sure what this game even was. Never heard that people hated it either, because apparently they do, and after playing it myself, I'm not even the least bit surprised. So basically what we have here is a multiplayer party game presented as a trivia game show starring Chef as the host. Now, this game is clearly intended to be played with multiple people. It allows for up to 4 players, each of them being able to choose one of the 4 boys, but there aren't any options for CPU opponents, so unlike something like Mario Party where you can still have some fun playing against CPUs, Chef's Love Shack not only doesn't have that option, but also allows you to literally play against no opponents, meaning you will, no matter how badly you play, automatically win. I have absolutely no idea why they couldn't be bothered to at least include CPU opponents. I get the entire draw of a party game is to play with friends, but the option should still be there so the game isn't totally useless when you want to play by yourself. Or make a YouTube video covering it or something. After choosing your character and the number of turns you want the game to last, you're thrown into the action. Each round has 3 trivia questions, and after choosing the category for the round, you're given a random-ass question whose degree of relevance to the source material seemingly has 0 rhyme or reason. Sometimes you'll get questions that pertain directly to South Park trivia. This is fine. This is how I would assume the game would ask questions, but sometimes it just kind of asks you random real-world questions that are supposed to bear some kind of relevance to the show, but more often than not, is so far off and so much of a stretch that I struggle to see how they thought it would even make sense to include in a game about South Park. Not dissimilar to Mario Party, at the end of each round, you get to play a random minigame to earn more points. There's a bunch of games, I believe around 20, but I wasn't really trying to stick around to play Chef's Love Shack solo for hours, so I myself only played a handful of them. They ranged from South Park Flappy Bird to South Park Micro Machines to South Park Whack-A-Mole. Have a blast. There's even South Park Asteroids. They're all these very basic 1 or 2 button minigames. Sometimes they're okay, sometimes they're just annoying, but you're never gonna find yourself eager to play any of these. The worst part though is that if you aren't playing by yourself and you have a full game of 4 people, As I said, there are only around 20 minigames, meaning you'll quickly exhaust all of them and start repeating the same minigames you've already played over and over. I'm assuming this starts to happen with the trivia questions as well if you constantly play this game for any amount of time. I probably don't need to tell you this, but the player with the most points at the end of the game wins, and that's all she wrote. The credits roll, you can play again, but I'm not sure why you'd want to unless you're using it as some weird method of teaching yourself discipline, or if you just enjoy putting yourself in an endless loop akin to purgatory. Now, the game is actually a bit impressive in the sound department. Not because it sounds good, though, mind you, because all the voice samples sound like they were filtered through a memory foam pillow, but the fact that there's this much dialogue in an N64 game is still actually pretty surprising to see. As I said, the game also came out for the PS1 and Dreamcast, but those consoles benefit in this area due to being able to utilize CD-based audio. That stuff is a lot more tricky to slap onto a cartridge, but they managed to do it, and despite the aforementioned pillow filter, there's a lot of voice samples here, and they're all good quality, no bit crunch to be heard. That, though, is about all the good I can possibly muster up about this game. It's just bad. It's really hard to try and pull any kind of enjoyment out of this one, and there also just isn't even enough content in it. Playing it for this video was fine, I guess. It's like, whatever, cool, I experienced it. Maybe if you're a fan, give it a spin once so you could just say you have, but I'm willing to bet money you're not gonna want to play this shit more than one time. This was very clearly a cash grab, a rush to cash in on the popularity of the IP with no real vision to actually make a fun game, let alone actually give the game any kind of substantial content. This fact alone is why it doesn't surprise me that they released it on so many platforms. When talking about the N64, one of the first things to come to mind is probably kart racers. Of course, the obvious one is Mario Kart 64, followed by Diddy Kong Racing, but there were a ton of games that did their own take on the genre back then, some even going a little bit under the radar and not really being appreciated fully until later on, like Mickey Speedway USA. South Park Rally was one of the many kart racers available for the console, and acclaimed swan song for the South Park games they released during this generation. Now, much like Chef's Love Shack, the game was also released for the PS1, Windows, and Dreamcast, but given the genre and the fact that I've been looking at the N64 releases up until now, I'm sticking with the Nintendo one for this one. Now, in concept, this seems like it could be a slam dunk, right? Kart racers were all the rage at the time, and South Park, even back then, had a big roster of original and memorable characters, as well as creative set pieces in the show, all which would lend itself well to a Mario Kart clone. Unfortunately, in execution, this was another swing and a miss. Now, apparently, the actual developer of the game, Tantalus, hadn't had all that many releases prior to South Park Rally, and even then, it was the first game they had developed for every console it appeared on, so it's already at risk of being a little bit of a rocky situation, but the game also was yet another rushed release, being developed in only 7 months. Honestly, whenever I talk about one of these situations, I half expect the studio that I'm talking about to no longer exist in present day, but not only do they still exist, but they're still going strong, most recently working on Skyward Sword HD for the Switch. Suffice it to say, I have a feeling they're probably doing just fine. Back to the game at hand, though. I'm gonna be straight up with you. This shit sucks, man. I couldn't even play it. I wish I was kidding. I tried. I really did. But I couldn't even get past the first stage. Luckily, I've seen enough of the game to be able to talk about it, but as far as first-hand experience goes, the first track is about the extent of it. However, the game is the game. It operates how it operates. I don't need to play every Mario Kart track to know how Mario Kart works. So it's set up like any kart racer you've played before. There's a main mode and multiplayer. You can choose any number of characters to start out, but there's a ton of characters that can be unlocked during play. It's actually kind of a shame because nothing is a mystery here. Sure, the character models can't be seen, but you know who each and every unlockable character is before unlocking any of them, and to me, that kind of spoils it. But it's fine, I guess. Each character also has their own kart. Each is character specific, and they really tried to make the karts relevant to the characters that pilot them, as opposed to just some generic cars, and that's a nice touch that I wish would have carried on to the rest of the game. See, for some reason, in an effort to maybe be unique, instead of a regular linear track lap system, the tracks are non-linear, and you need to reach specific checkpoints in order to complete a lap. This is extremely convoluted and gets really confusing because you end up needing to constantly look at the mini-map the first few times you try a new stage. It also doesn't help that the CPU characters don't always go the right way, so you can't just follow them for direction. Not that you'd want to do that anyway, because guess what? You literally cannot progress in the game unless you get first place in a race. The CPUs are all very cheap, and the game controls like utter dog shit, so it took me a few tries to actually place, but when I finally got third in a race, I thought for sure the game would let me progress, but nope. First place or no place. And I can tell you right now, I ain't getting no first place anytime soon. The game controls so poorly that it's hard to avoid stage hazards, which the game throws at you constantly, and every 5 seconds you have an opponent who hits you with one of the plethora of items that can be found throughout the tracks. When it comes to you, though, good luck trying to actually use any of the items because it's near impossible to actually aim anything, so you just kind of have to get lucky. The only items that are ever actually useful are the Terrence and Phillips, which give you a speed boost a la mushrooms in Mario Kart. Now, this is basically rinse and repeat for however many tracks there are. I've seen most of them. They all look okay, nothing too exciting. There is a little bit of variety, but it's nothing to really write home about. I'll admit the colors are nice, as South Park's colorful aesthetic is charming, but if I'm being honest here, the camera whips around way too much for me to enjoy any of it, and I get motion sickness, so not trying to puke over South Park Rally for the N64. This one could have been so easy. The groundwork was right there. They didn't even have to do anything original as long as the game controlled well, and stuck to a traditional kart racer formula. It would have been a hit, but apparently that was too much to ask. I know Matt and Trey aren't proud of any of these 5th generation games that came out, and while I will vehemently stand up for the South Park game, the first one, I totally get why they'd want to bury these and forget they exist. Hey, real quick, if you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, consider subscribing. I know a lot of people get tired of hearing it, but it really does make a huge difference, especially now that I've started making these longer videos that take more production time. That's all I want to say. Now back to the video. In a similar vein to the Game Boy Color one, this is another bit of a weird inclusion. Another canceled game here, and a game even more canceleder than the Game Boy Color one. Back in 2004, a GTA/Simpsons hit-and-run clone based on South Park was being worked on by Ubisoft, which, as I'm sure you know by now, didn't come to fruition. And here to help me out and talk about it a little bit is LS Mark. Take it away!
Hi, South Park, huh? Back in 2015, my 13-year-old self was absolutely blown away at the discovery of a cancelled South Park game, which was typically nothing new, with a Game Boy game that was pretty much entirely finished before being stripped of all the South Park branding. But this one is really special, in that it's a fully 3D South Park game that took heavy influence from The Simpsons Hit and Run, which already took heavy influence from Grand Theft Auto, and by heavy influence, I mean ripped off. Led by Ubisoft, who subsequently passed it down to a mostly unknown third-party studio, BuzzMonkey, the game has Simpsons Hit and Run plastered all over it, the same UI, the same sound effects, the same map. It's pretty shameless, although undoubtedly would have been changed if it actually got finished. Not much of the game is available here, clearly just being a short proof of concept which shows you the various different styles it would consist of, like driving around a massive 3D interpretation of the South Park town, empty test stages where you could look at some of the other character models beyond the main 4 boys, and test out the combat. Which, while it doesn't look incredibly in-depth or anything, at the very least give it something to stand out against Hit and Run. The only part of the game that's really playable is a mission where Cartman is tasked with sneaking inside the South Park mental house, and so you have to run around his house collecting the same outfit he wore in Up the Down Steroid, where he's then mistaken for a patient and strapped down to be electrocuted, which activates his sense-dormant V-chip from the South Park movie, killing everyone and allowing his escape. The end. If this short mission was anything to go by, I have to assume this game would have just ended up being a selection of random levels only really used as excuses to shove in as many references to the show as possible, strung together with a very loose plot, which isn't a problem. Again, I understand why they wanted to rip off Hit and Run, it was great, but I'm not sure how wide of a market this game would have had. Like, I'm sure most parents were fine with getting their kids a Simpsons-themed video game. I mean, sure, it's an adult comedy, but there's a clear discrepancy between it and South Park. It's why them trying to make the first game an FPS at least made some sense conceptually. The graphics too were just kinda unpleasant to look at, with its muted color palette and freakish character models for the boys which look more like f***ing Roblox skins more than anything else. The game was found 7 years ago on an old Xbox development kit. There was no record of it having existed before then, so this was a massive surprise to everyone. And since then, we've learned a bit more about what this game was aiming to be and why it got cancelled. Apparently Matt and Treb possibly knew of its existence, but if they did then they didn't give a shit because they had little to no input whatsoever. A far cry compared to the more direct hands-on approach they give to later South Park games. But apparently things fell through for a mixture of reasons. One being the tight development time, with the game only having been worked on for 10 months and Ubisoft wanting it out the door as soon as possible, given this console's generation's lifespan was coming to a close at that time. I think the original Rayman 4 was cancelled by them for a similar reason. Also, one of the producers was apparently super unprofessional to work with, them being fired not too long after cancellation. So all of this combined probably didn't give Ubisoft much confidence in this being a hit, critically or financially. This build was for March, but the project wasn't officially cancelled until around half a year later. So a newer version of this game certainly exists somewhere, but if it never resurfaces, I still think what we have here would have been a good enough indication as to how this game would have ended up. Meh.
For For almost a decade following South Park Rally, there was a pretty big dry spell as far as South Park video games go. I assume after the initial 3 games released by Acclaim, Matt and Trey probably had a bad taste in their mouths and were reluctant to do more South Park games. Matt and Trey have been pretty vocal about their distaste for those games, so it doesn't really surprise me at all. But it's pretty crazy that 3 games were dropped over the course of 2 years and then nothing else for almost 10. Weirdly enough, the IP wouldn't finally return to video games with a full-on AAA release, but rather a brief 2-game stint on Xbox Live Arcade for the 360, starting with South Park Let's Go Tower Defense Play. South Park games, for a long time anyway, had no consistency to speak of. It's clear no one knew what to do with the IP when it came to making games based on it. And if you ask someone who had no prior knowledge what genre they thought the games based on South Park were, I'm sure they'd get most of the answers wrong. I'm even more sure that likely no one would assume there would be a South Park tower defense game. South Park Let's Go Tower Defense Play was released on Xbox Live Arcade for the Xbox 360 back in 2009, and it's a budget-priced game with a short campaign, designed to be played over and over again, especially with friends. You can totally play the game and beat the campaign by yourself, but the game is surely much more enjoyable and probably a lot easier with a group of friends. This game actually kind of reminds me of some games I used to play as a kid. Back in the late 90s, there were a ton of fan-made games for loads of different IPs, and when it came to South Park, it was seemingly endless. I remember there were games like South Park Dodgeball, a game called North Park vs. South Park, the list goes on, and these weren't Flash games either, mind you. This was the Wild West, and people were straight up downloading random EXE files with reckless abandon. What a time to be alive. I don't want to digress too much from the topic at hand, but all this to say that playing South Park Tower Defense Play brought me back to that time, and honestly, it could have fit right in with those games back then. A simple, short, but engaging, stupid little game based on the South Park IP. What sets this official game apart, though, is in its presentation. There's loads of cutscenes, voice acting, and a full-on story. Not that the story is very deep, mind you, but it is there. It's nothing too sensical or interesting, and mainly only serves to explain why you're fighting off hordes of enemies who want to attack the various locations that the stages take place in. As you play, you can even unlock tons of video clips from the show, as well as a bunch of secret characters that you can play as after you complete the game for the first time. Now, the gameplay is pretty simple, at least at first, but it does get a little more interesting as you progress. Basically, at any given time, you control one of the 4 boys and can switch between them at will. When you have a certain character selected, the rest of them will be controlled by the CPU, but they don't do much else besides throw snowballs at enemies. Only characters controlled by humans can move around the field. Being a tower defense game, your objective is to stop the enemies from making it past your defensive line. If too many get by, you fail the stage and need to start over. The way you stop them is in 3 different ways: chucking snowballs at them to attack them manually, building different kinds of weapons which cost coins that you earn from defeating enemies, and crafting a sort of maze by creating walls of snow to slow your enemies down. The weapons can also be upgraded for a fee, but you need to be smart about how many turrets you place versus how many you upgrade, since you only start off with a finite amount of money. Different weapons are also more effective or less effective depending on the enemy types they're used against, and as the game introduces new enemy types, you unlock access to new weapons to go along with them. But as your arsenal expands, so does the amount of money it costs to build or upgrade those new weapons. Each character also has his or her own special ability. Each has their own special meter which fills as you attack enemies, and once it's filled up, you can unleash said ability. Some are offensive, like Cartman's for example, which attacks every enemy on screen. Others, like Stan, do things like heal the town, which is basically your health meter. There's over a dozen total characters, and each one's ability offers something totally different, so I think it's actually pretty cool that they took the time to give each character a genuinely unique special ability. One thing I will say that kind of takes a bit of the fun away is the fact that in the pause menu, there's literally an option to just skip a stage, literally allowing you to complete a stage and move on to the next, progressing the campaign without actually doing anything. The penalty is that you'll receive the worst possible score for the stage, but you can literally complete the game without having played it. Helpful for creating YouTube videos, but not so much for satisfying video game campaign. In any case though, for $10 you can do a lot worse than this. The main campaign is short, but with all the unlockable characters and unlockable weapons which can all be used when playing through the campaign again from the start, coupled with the fact that there's a multiplayer aspect, clearly the game is meant to be played over and over with different characters and friends, and there's even some challenge stages if you get bored of the main campaign. I think this is a decent one. It's moderately fun, I'm sure it's even more fun with friends, but I'd say this one is pretty good and worth checking out if you still have an Xbox 360. It's clear that despite being short and simple, a lot more quality and care went into this one when compared to the original trilogy of games. Although, I did notice this weird spelling error with Tolkien's name here. Kind of a weird oversight. I don't know how that one slipped through the cracks. After Let's Go Tower Defense Play, they released another Xbox Live Arcade game in the same vein, but this time switching up genres. Since Stupid Nick would be upset if I made a South Park video without including him, here's Stupid Game Apologist talking about Stupid Tenorman's Revenge.
If you're reading the title South Park Tenorman's Revenge and you have no idea who Tenorman is, well, that's a shame because Scott Tenorman is, in his own weird ways, one of the most important characters in all of South Park. Largely because one of its most famous episodes revolves around him and Cartman. That episode being Scott Tenorman Must Die, in which he eats his own parents. Spoilers, this dropped all the way back in Season 5, but even to this day, with another 21 seasons on top of this, Scott Tenorman Must Die is going to show up near the tippy top of plenty of best of episode lists. And not just for South Park, but for television in general. But even though it's a well-remembered episode even to this day, newer fans have likely not even seen the next major Scott story if they've only ever experienced South Park through streaming. He's had a couple of quick cameos here and there, but the next time the plot focused on him would be in the back half of the notorious set of Banned episodes 200 and 201, which were also big deals when they first aired for particular reasons we don't need to get into here, but they were censored and eventually just scrubbed completely. And unfortunately, when they did, they also took away not only the return of Tenorman, but a major reveal for Cartman's character. Turns out Cartman's mom and Scott's dad had a bit of a thing back in the day, and, well, yeah, long story short, Scott is actually Cartman's half-brother, and Cartman unknowingly got his own dad killed during the events of Scott Tenorman Must Die, and that also, more heartbreakingly, makes Cartman a half-ginger. But all of that brings us to Tenorman's Revenge. I didn't really expect much from this little title, but this isn't just a game. This is actually the third part of what looks to be a Tenorman trilogy. Just don't expect anything too exciting. As I was going through the game, I was thinking this might actually be the death of Scott Tenorman himself, but we have seen him later on in cameos in the show itself, so yeah, don't even get that. Not much story here. Scott has stolen the hard drive off the boys' Xbox 360, which guess could be a reason why they didn't bother moving this game off the 360 marketplace. This does age the hell out of it. The boys have to travel through many iconic locations while they battle ginger terminators, chickens with breasts, oh, just got that, demons, and inevitably Scott himself in their quest to reclaim their save files. The gameplay itself is, well, pretty solid, which is good because I wasn't even sure what the genre of this game was before I played it. I've never seen much of this game in way of coverage. I don't know why, but I wasn't expecting this to be a collectathon multiplayer platformer, but here we are. Considering just how many genres this series has played around with, I'm surprised they haven't done this before or since. But that's probably because when I was growing up, the platformer was the go-to genre for licensed games. But this wasn't released in the 90s. This is an early 2012 release, long after the platforming heyday, which might be part of the reason why this didn't take so well. But this was a couple years after New Super Mario Bros. Wii, which was still demolishing sales charts in 2012. So I guess it's no surprise that see the potential of letting you and your friends hop around as all four South Park boys at once. It's just like Mario, except with more cursing, which I think we all can agree is what the series has been missing. You probably have a pretty good idea of what is expected of you when I say a collectathon platformer. Like most games in the genre, you're ultimately trying to make your way from point A to point B, but it's not just enough to beat the level, you also obviously have to collect a lot of things, like the Mega Mans. There are 3 in each level, or time particles, which are like rings or coins, except there's a whole bunch of them here, like well over 1,000 in each level, and each one you grab takes a little bit off of your timer, and if you beat a level under a certain time, it'll give you a medal for your troubles. But the main thing you're after are time cores. There's a set number of them in each level, and you'll need a certain amount of them to unlock more levels. Time cores can be sitting in plain sight, just on the direct path of the goal, but plenty of others will be hidden in crates or behind locked doors that you have to unlock with keys, some of which are made out of poo, or in one of the many branching paths that largely focus on the abilities of one of the boys. Stan's ability to throw a football, Cartman can gut check weak walls, levels. Kyle can stun ginger bots and temporarily deactivate ginger shields by showing off his ginger hair, and Kenny gets a very helpful high jump. You can also come across superhero icons, which transforms you into your player's alter ego, and that in turn gives you different abilities. The Coon can wall jump, Human Kite can glide, Toolshed drills downward through specific surfaces, and Mysterion can run around as an invincible ghost, requiring you first to actually get the character killed. I thought that was a clever touch. As for general movement, I thought things were a little floaty at first. I've never expected Cartman to jump that high, but I quickly got a hang of the physics and had myself a pretty good time. You can hop on enemies to take off their skin, and then another to take out their robot bodies. There are some ginger bots who have spiked hairs, meaning you can't jump on them directly, so you'll instead have to shove them over. But considering the little stubs of all of these characters, getting in that close does risk damage. Thankfully, Cartman's gut check, Kyle's stun, and of course Stan's long-range football can help mitigate the risks of getting hurt. You also have bats, crowbars, water balloons, bubble guns, and some other fun weapons that can help out in combat, which is appreciated because not only do you have to take out enemies while you're hopping around, but you do occasionally get wrapped up in gauntlets that you can't move on from until you take down every last hairy scrotum. I will not be elaborating any further than that. It's a South Park video. Going by the reviews of its day, while multiplayer can prove to be a fun time, considering just how sprawling these maps can be, it could be a mess giving priority to players and what they're trying to accomplish. And apparently, trying to connect with others online could sometimes be a chore. And multiplayer aside, a solo adventure seemed fairly fruitless. There are so many time cores locked behind paths that required certain abilities, and you could only play one character at a time when you started a level. And considering just how many time cores you need to advance through the game, that would require you to play through the levels over and over again if you were doing this by yourself. Thankfully, all this time later, I didn't have to deal with any of that. At some point, Other Ocean, the developers behind the game, updated Revenge to make it much more solo player friendly, allowing you to swap between the characters whenever you'd like, and where the checkpoints were once few and far between, there are plenty more nowadays, which is probably why this game was fairly easy to roll through. But yeah, even with these updates, it's still fairly obvious these levels were designed with multiple players in mind. And by yourself or with friends, these giant maps are just a bit too sprawling for my liking. I thankfully didn't have any problems grabbing enough time cores to make my way through the game all in one go, but I cannot imagine going back to 100% completing this game. And even with all that aside, a lot of these levels overstay their welcome. I did not expect this game to last as long as it did. It took me like 8 to 10 hours just playing through this thing the first time. And that's with the updates. I didn't have to go and repeat any of these levels with different characters. I was a bit drained when this was all said and done. Like I said, I can't imagine I'll be back to clean up any of these collectibles, and it doesn't seem like there's much in the way of rewarding completionists, so why even bother? Also doesn't help that the boys themselves seem completely frustrated with this entire adventure. They're just irritated and exhausted, and I do appreciate them acknowledging that time bombs suck, but maybe just don't have time bombs then. Yeah, that's another thing you have to occasionally deal with. Scott will set up a time bomb you will need to get to and then destroy before it goes off, because if it does, it's going to reset and you'll have to restart the challenge all over again. There's no way around it. Some of them can be fairly quick and easy, especially if you know what you're doing, but for my first few times, I was struggling. I didn't realize that I needed specifically a crowbar to take out the bomb, so I had to go back and find one. There was one time I thought I could use a bat, but nope, can't use a bat. It was just annoying, and if you failed to meet the challenge in time, you have to sit through a couple of tedious cutscenes, and they do give you the option to skip through them, but the fade to black every time you do that is so long, it's completely pointless. You're gonna have to wait either way. It's fine. Like I said, most of the time bombs aren't that bad, and it is kind of a clever challenge. But if you don't know what you're doing, and even sometimes when you do, it can be exhausting, especially when it's in the middle of an already long level. But all that said, I did jump into this game specifically for this video, so yeah, I did rush this, and that absolutely was a factor in my exhaustion. I was more impressed than not with this game. It's not perfect, but it's a solid time, and they did go to the effort to make it far more fun for the solo experience, and they did a wonderful job of representing the series. This is when South Park Digital Studios was starting to kick into gear. They already had the Tower Defense game under their belt, and that same care can be seen in Tenorman's Revenge. Matt and Trey do all the voices, they use assets from the show, and while South Park is simple enough to replicate in other media, it's the little details that make this feel like South Park, especially in the animations, like when the boys carefully place weapons on their back when they go on ladders, and you can see them actually get on their hands and knees when they need to crawl. It doesn't just pop into that position. And I like these mosquito gorilla things that go, oh shucks, every time they miss you when they're trying to dive bomb you. They put just as much care here as they do in animating the show itself, and I appreciate that. And I think other fans will as well. Same with all the Easter eggs and references, especially around this era of the show. We go to the atheist future, heaven. I appreciate the little touch of confirming that outside of Kenny. This is the first time the boys have been to heaven. We also go to hell, Peru, where we see some guinea pigs running around in the background, and some other stuff I'm just not going to tell you here, because why on earth would you pick up a game called Tenorman's Revenge unless you're a South Park fan? Truth be told, a part of me feels like this game, as well as the notorious set of episodes 200 and 201, could stay buried because bringing back Scott in such a big way does undercut the brilliance of that original Scott Tenorman Must Die episode. It was a simple, silly story with gross out humor that turned into one of the wildest twists in the show's history. It is always going to be brilliant, and a part of me feels like the most they should have done with Scott Tenorman from then on would be the occasional clever little callback joke. But all that said, having Scott go all killing joke and play supervillain, while that is over the top, is still very much in line with South Park, especially in this era. They were doing world-ending shticks and parodies all the time in these seasons. No, this doesn't go quite as hard as the later games, but I do think that this one is unfairly overlooked. We were 2 years out from Stick of Truth, but everybody was well aware of that game's existence. They knew that was on the way, and I saw plenty of comments saying that they would just wait for that game to come out and skip this one. And yeah, Stick of Truth is a better game, don't get me wrong, but this, like most South Park games, is a completely different gameplay experience. And if you happen to have a 360 around and 3 other friends who love the show, go check it out while it's still available. It's well worth the $10.
So aside from the couple smaller games we got, we really, for decades, never had a truly good and full-scale South Park game. Everything that had come out since the show's inception was either rushed, lackluster, not really a full-size game, and in the case of some of them, straight up canceled. Finally though, in 2014, we'd get South Park, The Stick of Truth. The first true AAA South Park game with involvement from Matt and Trey, and they weren't going to let past mistakes repeat themselves. It wasn't smooth sailing though. Initially, Matt and Trey had chosen Obsidian to develop the game, being fans of that studio's work, and even self-funded the game through South Park Studios to preserve the spirit of the show and not to be pressured to potentially censor themselves to attract investors. For a while, the development was pretty troubled, with multiple cancellations, and eventually the rights to the game ended up in the hands of Ubisoft, who ended up delaying the release further to rework a lot of the game. Despite its rocky development though, the game did finally come out, and honestly, judging by the final product, it's safe to say the game ultimately ended up in good hands. I'll be straight up right from the start and say that not only is The Stick of Truth my favorite South Park game, it's also one of the most enjoyable RPGs I've ever played. This time around, we have a turn-based RPG that is quite literally, well, it's Paper Mario. It's South Park Paper Mario, and it's very fitting considering the show's art style is based on papercraft. I still don't know if that correlation was intentional or not, but it just makes a whole lot of sense. For the first time, we have a truly, fully explorable South Park, and while I always did praise the N64 game for having an explorable town, the scope of Stick of Truth's map is not only much bigger and actually packed with things to do as opposed to being relegated to a single stage, they nailed the visuals to a T. Playing or watching The Stick of Truth looks basically indistinguishable from the show, and only really breaks that in the uncommon instances that the game shows any performance drops. They completely mimic the aesthetic of the show, and not only does it look exactly like the show, but it feels exactly like the show too. The game basically plays out like a feature-length film version of a South Park episode, and you'd maybe think that it's hard to translate the pacing of a 22-minute per episode show to a 10 to 12-hour video game, but it really does work and never feels like it's dragging on. It's consistently engaging and basically plays out like a very long but very good episode of South Park. As I said before, it's basically Paper Mario, and I mean that in the sense that the battle system is extremely similar. If you're familiar with Paper Mario's battle system, you'll quickly take to this. Turn-based combat with secondary party members assisting you in combat with real-time button mechanics, just like in Paper Mario. Now, I say secondary party members because you do build up a good amount of them, but from my experience with the game, it's kind of pointless to use anyone besides Butters because his healing powers are broken. Now, the party members you end up gathering are the 4 boys plus Butters and Jimmy. but they're all secondary. Instead of taking control of one of the 4 main characters of the show for your adventure, the Stick of Truth actually has you create your own character at the start of the game, known simply as the New Kid, or douchebag. You play the typical silent protagonist role, which was honestly the right way to go in my opinion. You play as your own created character, but your lack of dialogue lets the show's many established characters take control of the story. So it's almost like you get to be a fly on the wall for everything going on. Don't get me wrong, narratively you do play a big role, but as far as the actual storytelling goes, it's all about the characters you're familiar with and not necessarily throwing in a new character into the mix. Despite this though, the game does have fun with it and your silence does not go unnoticed by the other characters. Everywhere you look in this game, there's nods to different elements or memorable parts of the series. It's quite literally packed to the brim with member berries. I don't really want to give away the story, but as you can probably tell, it's heavily based on and themed around the groundwork set by the Lord of the Rings episode of the show. There are some newer elements that are also thrown into the mix, pulled from, at the time, more recent events of the show, but most of the costumes and theming is based on the kids' costumes from the Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. South Park: The Stick of Truth really, truly feels like you're playing an episode of South Park. It's a long episode of the show made interactive. It's packed with tons of references that longtime fans of the show will appreciate, even going all the way back to Season 1. It's a great RPG in its own right, and honestly, even though it's meant for fans of the show and really is the perfect game for South Park fans, I think anyone who enjoys turn-based RPGs can have a ton of fun with this one. And you know what? I've been saying this for years, but for anybody who's been upset over the direction the Paper Mario series has taken after the Thousand Year Door, this is a game you absolutely should play. It definitely scratches the itch that the Paper Mario series left behind. And I know since then we've gotten quite a few Paper Mario-inspired RPGs, but this was, I believe, the first one to do it, and it's also one of the best. Definitely check this out if you're a South Park fan. Definitely check this out if you're a Paper Mario fan. Just trust me when I say you need to play this game if you haven't. This one's a bit of a weird one, but a video game is a video game. Now, a lot of you have probably stumbled upon the South Park pinball table if you've ever been to an arcade over the years. It's a fun little table, and I always try to play it whenever I see it. That, however, isn't the pinball table we're looking at today. I don't want to give a whole history lesson on this game series as it's not all that important to the topic of the video, and if I'm being honest here, I still don't really understand it as it's gone by a couple different names. I always knew it as Zen Pinball, but I believe at some point the name shifted to Pinball Effects, with multiple iterations coming out over the years and developed by a team called Zen Studios. I think the naming scheme has something to do with which platform the game is released on, but it's pretty confusing and I could definitely be wrong, so I'm not going to talk about that. In any case, it basically aims to replicate true real-life pinball physics in video game form, with tons of recreations of actual pinball tables you'd find in arcades. However, it doesn't stop at recreations. There are completely original tables you can play that exist solely in the game. And in 2014, 2 South Park-themed pinball tables were released not only as add-ons for Zen Studios' game, but also as a standalone app on mobile. One is called South Park Super Sweet Pinball, basically an all-encompassing South Park table whose themes span the entire show's history at the time, and another called South Park Butter's Very Own Pinball Game, which is obviously totally Butters themed, taking its title directly from Season 5, Episode 14 of South Park. An episode which revolves entirely around Butters, called Butters' Very Own Episode. Now, I do happen to like pinball a lot, but truth be told, I kinda suck at it. Each pinball table has its own goals and rules, but I am not very good at figuring out what they are, and every time I play pinball, I just kind of try to rack my score up and avoid getting a game over. It's difficult enough trying to figure out different rules and goals of pinball tables I'm playing, and, well, it's even more difficult here because I'm not playing. This is not my gameplay because there's no legal way for it to be. Both tables have since been pulled from every storefront due to what I assume is some kind of licensing issue. So, as of this point in time, there's just no way to play these games. Not legitimately anyway, unless you'd still own them. The game was released on, I believe, every platform at the time and was available on PC, so sure, I could go a different route and, acquire them, but I decided against that, so unfortunately I can't speak firsthand to how these games actually play. I will say, though, that they are super charming. Like I said, in the main South Park theme table, it spans the entirety of the show at the point in time in which it came out, and the table does do a good job of making references to very early points in the series, as well as at the time more recent ones. Spanning from a can of Wakegain 4000 being featured as part of the decor and Cartman teasing Stan for liking Wendy, all the way up to having an entire Sarcastaball section in the back right-hand corner of the table. Also, I'm pretty sure on occasions the pinballs turn into Yes, I do believe that is poop. In general, there's just a whole lot going on this first table. There's characters everywhere, constant sound bites from the show being triggered, and it seems like there's a way to rack up points scattered in every nook and cranny of this table. Truthfully, it's not very realistic in terms of pinball table design, and it seems like they really tried to pack as much stuff into it as they could. Not that that's a bad thing, it just definitely seems like a lot more of a video gamey type of thing than an authentic pinball table. Now, this craziness has definitely reined in when it comes to the Butters table, which is a lot more realistic and toned down in its design. Even by first glance, you can tell this one seems to fall a lot more in line with what you might see in an arcade. See, the main gimmick of this table is that it's based on the slew of personas and alter egos that Butters has had over the years. While the table itself is themed around the many episodes of the show where Butters has been a focus, the mechanics revolve around the many different characters Butters has played throughout the series, like Professor Chaos, Montekia, or Margarine. From what I gather, this table is a little more difficult than Super Sweet Pinball, and that's probably due to the mechanics being a little more realistic. In any case, though, both of these tables seem super fun and charming, and they're both packed to the brim with references, quotes, and nods to the series. Any fan of South Park would have a good time with this. I don't even think you need to be a huge pinball fan to enjoy it, but, obviously being a pinball fan would help. Unfortunately, though, like I mentioned, these tables have been delisted, so short of already having owned them or being lucky enough to pick up a secondhand game console that happens to have the DLC installed, there's no way to legitimately own or play these. Obviously, as I said, the game was available on PC, so if you really want to experience these tables, it's completely possible, and I'd say if you're a big fan, it would be worth doing so, but it's really a shame that it needs to come to that. So if these look fun to you, I'd try to get my hands on them. Licensing be damned. In 2017, they would follow up The Stick of Truth with its eagerly awaited sequel. It's one I haven't played in quite a while, but when I did, I loved it. There were some mix-ups to the core gameplay that, in terms of mechanics, made me prefer The Stick of Truth, but as an overall experience, I'd say they upped their game quite a bit from its predecessor. Since I need a little refresher on the game, and since he literally just did a video on it, I asked my buddy Johnyy Two Cellos to come on and talk about the game for a bit. The floor is all yours.
So, South Park The Stick of Truth is still one of my favorite video game experiences, particularly just as a South Park fan. They did such a great job making you feel like you'd been dropped right into the middle of an ongoing South Park story. Needless to say, my anticipation for its sequel, The Fractured But Whole, was off the charts, and I picked it up the day it came out. However, I didn't actually beat the game until years later, because at first, I struggled with the changes they made. However, now that I've properly finished the game and really clicked with the updated combat, I find myself thinking back on it even more fondly than Stick of Truth. The game adds a significant layer of polish to just about every aspect, from the animation to the menus to the combat. Fractured But Whole is fully elevated into video game territory. That isn't to say I don't miss the charm of Stick of Truth, but I appreciate that for the sequel they decided to step up and deliver a more polished experience, a story and execution that could only be delivered in video game format. But I also loved how the game built on the previous narratively, delivering what felt like both a new game experience and a proper sequel to Stick of Truth. The opening begins as though the kids are still just playing in their fantasy world, and the initial battle tutorials are fantasy themed before Cartman drops in as the coon to get the kids to play superheroes. The idea of the kids just changing games was not only a fun way to transition themes, but also delivered a solution to the thing that so many game sequels dread. How do you strip your main character of their abilities in a satisfying way? With these stories all being a part of these kids' imaginations, there are completely different hierarchies in different games. You may have risen to prominence as a king in the fantasy game, but as a superhero, you're nobody, bottom of the totem pole. But the story also directly follows up some of the mysteries surrounding the new kid character that were initially revealed at the end of Stick of Truth, particularly about his farting powers and his social media friend-making abilities. It would have been easy for Matt and Trey to just build out a separate narrative, but a lot of these details and reveals end up more satisfying if you play both games. The game also expands on South Park itself, making space for more classic locations from the series like Raisins, the Peppermint Hippo, the Senior Center, the Community Park, Buca di Facchino, and MFC. But on top of introducing these classic spots, they altered South Park to represent some of the changes the town had seen in the show between the first and second game. In Season 19, the town had a wave of gentrification hit, with Skeeter's becoming a wine bar, a microbrewery called Crunchy's moving in, and even maintaining the abandoned ruins of Soda Sopa near historic Kenny's house. Fractured But Whole also provides far more customization options for your create a character, adding new hairstyles and facial features, and where the previous forced you to play as a boy, this one allows you to pick your own gender identity. Boy, girl, non-binary, cis, trans, the works. Stick of Truth also sort of pigeonholed your costume customization by tying combat abilities to outfits, so the best costume options for you in combat might not be something you actually wanted to wear. But with this game being about creating your own superhero persona, they opted to give a ton of costume options that you can gather as the game goes on, with customizable color palettes and no effects on the combat system. Speaking of combat, the system has been entirely overhauled, and while it took me a while to adjust, as someone who actually quite likes the simple Paper Mario style turn-based action command combat, it's very clear how many more possibilities there are with the new tactical grid-based system, not just forcing you to think more critically about how you assemble your team of various heroes, based on abilities, but also providing much more specialized combat scenarios, oftentimes based around battlefield hazards or special abilities from certain enemies. You'll deal with scenarios that you'll have to adjust to on the fly. Combat is just so much more dynamic and rewarding this time around. While it was fun to finesse and break the system in Stick of Truth, it's even more fun to strategize and succeed in real time in Fractured But Whole. And while the artifact system appeared to be a much more simpler leveling system on its face, the more you play, the more you realize how crucial the stats and bonus improvements from the artifacts actually are. Your entire strategy can be dictated by what artifacts you have in your arsenal. Are you trying to recover your ultimate as fast as possible to inflict massive damage? Does your character have many status effect abilities, leading you to focus on additional status effect damage bonuses? Do you want to prioritize health recovery? Personally, I racked up a ton of knockback combo damage bonuses and equipped teams that had a ton of knockback abilities, often just sending foes ping-ponging between two team members for major damage. But for me, as a fan of South Park, I think what's most impressive about Fractured But Whole is how they weave together so many different parts of its complicated story. I truly love Stick of Truth for being such a digestible adventure that feels like you were dropped into a simple South Park story, but the Fractured But Whole feels more like one of their big, epic multi-part stories, something more akin to the Coon and Friends trilogy, 200/201, or even the newer post-COVID specials. While the game at first feels like it's pulling you in so many different directions with different quests, it eventually becomes clear how well each of these pieces of the game's story tie together into this big, complicated web of a narrative. And in classic South Park fashion, it starts with something very simple that the kids want, to find scrambles for the $100 reward, eventually escalating into something much, much bigger. This story immediately starts to lay out these pieces starting in the opening cutscene with the missing cats, but your first set of quests lay out even more. The town not being happy with the mayor, somebody trying to unite all of the crime rings in South Park, the police targeting African Americans in town, the new kid's parents becoming increasingly agitated about something regarding their child, and of course, the kid's dilemma, trying to form the perfect superhero franchise plan and breaking up because of their disagreements. With the blame for all of these things eventually being placed on Cartman's left-handed alter ego, Mitch Connor. The game does a great job building on a concept established in the series and using it to focus in on one of the most persistent truths in South Park. Cartman is the absolute worst. Of course he's the villain. I just love the insane lengths that Cartman is willing to go for his own selfish desires, swindling the entire town in the most elaborate ways so that his left hand can be voted in as mayor. The Fractured But Whole is such a substantial sequel to the Stick of Truth. I still believe that its polish eliminates a bit of charm I felt playing the first, but it fully makes up for that in scale and intricacy. The story feels like a massive epic akin to South Park's best multi-part episodes. The battle system features incredible variety and strategy, and much more creative and difficult specialized battles. The customization for your character is fully expanded, from abilities to design. South Park itself is far more robust, with more locations from across the show's history. It not only embraces the story reveals in the original game, but it fully expands on them in really fun ways. It does everything a sequel should do, and it feels like a story that they could only have told in a video game medium. And I am a huge fan.
So this is a bit of a weird one, and I honestly debated even including it. Normally, for these videos, I try to stick mainly to releases specifically for video game consoles, and really don't delve into anything in the mobile realm. That being said, I also normally cover actual video game series, and not necessarily the games made for non-video game specific IPs. I think in this case, since South Park is its own behemoth of a property, and since the history of video games it's had is pretty rocky and not very vast, I want to be thorough. This also just in general is a hard one to cover because, as I said, it's a mobile game. It released back in 2017, and if you know anything about mobile games, you know rarely, if ever, do they stay the same over the years. They update constantly, changing what's available, adding things, removing things, having new seasons, new content, new levels, all in an effort to keep things going and to typically keep you spending money on them. So I can't really look at this game from the eyes of someone who has actually had experience with it over the years. For all I know, South Park Phone Destroyer could be a completely different game in 2023 than it was in 2017. So with that being said, I'm just gonna be looking at this game as someone who has not played it literally ever until now, and someone who doesn't really play mobile games either. So, much like the more recent South Park games, the look of the game is straight up South Park. It looks just like the show, as we've come to expect by now. It also starts out with a pretty entertaining and funny cutscene, and cutscenes are also sprinkled throughout the game, which at this point is pretty much expected for a South Park game. The game even does this little interactive thing where Cartman calls you on the phone and you actually need to answer, although you can't reject the call. I tried. You start off by creating your character with an admittedly not very deep character creator, and you're off to the tutorial. The premise of the game is basically that the boys are unable to figure out what they want to LARP as today, and each set of levels take on different themes in terms of what the boys are playing as. It starts out as cowboys and Indians, with Cartman taking on the role of Sheriff Cartman, telling you to grab your phone and meet him wearing cowboy clothes. He shows you the ropes by guiding you through the first few stages, and eventually as the game goes on, we start seeing familiar themes like fantasy and superheroes. Each series of stages has a sort of final boss, and each stage has what I'd like to think of as mini-bosses. For example, in the first series of levels, once you beat all of them, you go up against Stan, but along the way, at the end of each stage, you fight some significant character like Sharon or Randy. Now, Phone Destroyer is a card-based RPG game. Once again, you play as the new kid, who has the ability to summon units from the cards in your hand, and the goal is to defend your tower and conserve your HP. Your success in battle relies on your deck, strategic placement and timing of cards, and level of cards, which you can upgrade after battles. I'm not going to go super in-depth and explain all the mechanics, but basically each deck can carry 12 cards and is restricted to a maximum of 2 themes, with the neutral theme being the one exception to the rule. Adding a card that does not belong to the deck will cause the game to ask if the player would like to replace one of the current themes with the one they are trying to add. Each card costs energy to play, represented by a number on the card, and can be played when the player has sufficient energy, which recharges automatically during battle, capping out at 10. Each card represents either a character or some kind of attack you can use, and each character operates differently, attacks differently, and has different strengths and weaknesses, and choosing when and where to utilize them is key. The goal is to make it past all of your opponent's defenses and attack them directly. Draining their HP then wins the game. As you'd expect of a mobile game, there's loot boxes galore, options to actually spend real money, there's PvP battles, events. It's all very par for the course when it comes to mobile games. I didn't play super far into the game, but I can definitely see myself getting a little addicted to it. I'm really not one to drain my precious phone battery on games, but I really did have some fun with this one. It's engaging, pretty fun, and it's not lacking at all in terms of the South Park charm. It's entertaining and funny, which honestly, ever since the Stick of Truth, it's not only important, but required. It's kind of cool too, because there's South Park episode-esque content that I didn't know even existed, tucked away in things like Phone Destroyer. It's like getting a little bit of extra show that you weren't even aware existed. Like I said, I'm not a mobile game guy, but Phone Destroyer is actually pretty fun, and I definitely think it's worth giving a shot. No idea what the game was like when it first came out, but as of right now at least, it's fun, it's entertaining, and it's free. I think that's the most important part here. You don't actually need to spend any money to get enjoyment out of it, and I think for that reason alone, that's enough for me to recommend it. Go download the game, it's free, it's fun, nothing to lose here, except maybe some phone battery. And that's all of them. South Park has had quite the rocky history when it comes to video games, and it took a really, really long time to get to a place where not only do we get really good games, but a constant level of quality and consistency. It's understandable why the old games back in the day weren't up to Matt and Trey's standards. I mean, their involvement was borderline non-existent, but like anything they get their hands on, they always seem to maintain a really high level of quality in literally everything they do, which we've seen time and time again. It took a couple decades, but the Stick of Truth really put us in a good place, and while I do still have a soft spot for the old FPS and the N64, I'm glad they actually make good games now, and I can't wait to see what they do next. They're currently working on a follow-up to The Fractured But Whole, and while I have no idea what it could be or what the theme could be, I'm sure whatever it is will be yet another great experience. They clearly know what went wrong in the past and have learned from it. The fact that the Stick of Truth turned out how it did, despite such troubled development, is a testament to that. Oh, And thanks again to LS Mark, Game Apologist, and Johnyy Two Cellos for helping me out. All their respective channels will be down in the description. Please go check them out. They're all fantastic. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too. Toodles!